Hi students, welcome to video 1 of your analysis essay prep. So far we've learned how to write the synthesis essay and we practiced that 3 times with the final essay being graded. Now we've moved on to question 2 in this series of free response questions, which is your analysis essay. Now remember that this one has a very different purpose. Instead of synthesizing sources to create your own personal argument. In these type of essays, you're going to break speeches and articles down into their parts, looking for literary devices and literary strategy, and analyze those to argue what the author's intention or message was. So for this one, what we're going to do is I'm going to have you read through it, and then we're going to discuss how you should annotate it. And you should have this speech printed out and in front of you, and I would like for you to annotate along with the video. So when you turn your work in for this prep, please make sure that you have a fully annotated speech to turn into me. Now, I'm not going to read this out loud to you, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to indicate what section you should read, pause the video, and then go ahead and read it, and then restart. So do me a favor, read this opening paragraph, pause your video, read it, and then when you're done reading, hit play. So in this opening section, you're not analyzing this. What this provides to you is background information that you can use in your introduction, and also it just gives you direction. So don't annotate this, just use it as background in your introduction paragraph. Excellent. Now if you could go through and read this first column right here, and then when you're done, go ahead and start the video again. So pause, read, and then hit play. Excellent. So let's go ahead and start annotating this section. What is it that you should have noticed? So the first thing you may have noticed is this repetition of great. So the repetition emphasizes that the president, or that Ronald Reagan is a president, an American, and a man. And this is a sentiment that the author is going to revisit at the end of her speech. However, we want to note that by using this repetition, she emphasizes that he's great, but that he's a great many things. Additionally, she also then follows with this phrase, dear friend. And what that provides Margaret Thatcher is that because she had a close relationship with Ronald Reagan and worked with him in many ways, this gives her ethos. She knows him well so that she has the authority to describe his persona, and we can trust that what she says is accurate and true and earnest. Next, we move on to what's going to be contrasting diction. So we have cheerful and invigorating, which are very positive, positively connotated words to describe Ronald Reagan. And that contrasts the daunting, which has a negative connotation, history that he had to fight against, that he had to develop peace out of. And therefore we have contrasting diction that shows Ronald Reagan as being this amazing person in a very difficult time. Next, you might notice further positive diction, where we have that he mended America's wounded spirit, he restored the strength of the free world, and he freed the slaves of communism. So this phrasing, mend, restore, free, this very positive use of different verbs portray Reagan as a healer, a builder, and a savior. Next, we see further contrasting diction, heavy with risk, lightness of spirit. Here we have actually antithesis where heavy and lightness are opposite terms. And then we see again that Ronald Reagan with the lightness of spirit is able to accomplish things that had heavy risk. So again, we see this contrast where he's this amazing person who dealt with very difficult times. Then we have an allusion to Arnold Bennett, who said that the great cause of cheering us all up was Ronald Reagan's, essentially his cause, the great cause of cheering us all up. And so this allusion to Arnold Bennett gives authority to the quote itself, and ultimately the purpose of the quote and also the following explanation is to show that Ronald Reagan was an optimist that used his optimism to create unity. And this again contrasts with the following quote, evil empire. Now you'll note this number 1 here, and that corresponds to the very end of the essay where it has the footnote that explains this is a phrase used by Reagan to describe the Soviet Union. So please keep in mind that Arnold Bennett said this quote, but Ronald Reagan said this quote. And the purpose of this is again contrasting diction, good versus evil, where Ronald Reagan is shown as being this good individual with the great cause of cheering up the American people and possibly all the people of the world and fighting against evil empire. So this very differing diction of evil versus cheering. All right, let's move to further along. So if you could read this next column, it's a little longer, but go ahead and read through this, pause, read it, and then hit play. All right, so in this next section, what should you have noticed? So the first thing are these words: humor, jokes, reassurance, anxious. So again, we have contrasting diction. You're going to see that this exists throughout the entire speech. So it's definitely something that you're going to end up writing on. So again, we see that in the process of cheering up the American people, Ronald Reagan uses his humor and jokes to reassure an anxious world. So we see these positive terms versus this negative vocabulary. Next, we see one great heart and sane and jocular. And what these do is, again, they further the positive attributes of Ronald Reagan. Then we have right here Ronnie, which is a nickname for Ronald Reagan. So instead of Ronald, she calls him Ronnie. And this goes back to this idea of familiarity that she starts at the beginning. She knows him well, and therefore she uses this nickname to reassert the fact that she has authority over describing his persona. The fact that she calls him by a nickname shows that they are familiar with each other, shows that they were friends. Next, she goes into talking about religion. So she mentions that he told a priest after recovery, whatever time I've got left now belongs to the big fella upstairs. And so this brings in religious ethos. So the Reagan quote, what Reagan himself said, shows that he had a morality that centered within religion. And this gives him authority because religion's oftentimes used as a form of ethos, especially effective towards other individuals who are religious. And then we see this continued, this religious ethos, where she uses phrases such as providential, prophesied, faith, and mission. And so the analogy compares Ronald Reagan's actions to a religious task, where it makes Ronald Reagan seem like a savior to not only the American people, but to the world. And therefore, we see this religious ethos developed in this section. Next, we have a lot going on here. We see words like limits, growth, stagnant, engine, uneasy, one, enemy, friends. You've probably already called it. This is even more contrasting diction. And so we see a continuation of that where we see Ronald Reagan, this savior to the world, doing these positive things when faced with enemies and limits and stagnant economy in an uneasy time period. Then it moves on to alluding to Mikhail Gorbachev and the Geneva Summit. And so again, we go to our footnote. Gorbachev was the leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991. And so with this allusion, oh, I see what's happening. So we're going to go back to the top of the next column where it says, I'm sorry, I got a little lost. So it says, let me tell you why it is we distrust you. And so the allusion is alluding back to a very important time in history, which is the Cold War. And so she's shifting into bringing in this historical element. This makes sense because she's been talking pretty continuously about a difficult historical time period in which Ronald Reagan was a president. Now she's actually going to talk about what those difficulties were. And so she goes and alludes to a specific convention, the Geneva Convention, in order to help place us in history in the time period she's discussing. Then, oh, you know what? If you haven't read this yet, go ahead and pause and read this before we annotate. So pause, read, and then hit play. All right, so what we see next are these phrasings, different, different, new. And so I think actually what I intended this goes for here. What this quote is supposed to show is that Reagan was both a tough and fair man. It's the idea that he wasn't unfair to people who had differing beliefs. He wasn't unfair to other countries. He was quite fair to them, but the idea that he also wasn't a pushover, he wasn't going to let them walk over him, it shows that he's tough. And then when we see different, different, new, we see this repetition here that essentially constructs the idea that we live in a different world with new dangers, but that this world that we have was shaped by Ronald Reagan. All right, next we go into 8 of the most important years of all our lives. Again, this distinguishes the familiarity between Thatcher and Reagan, where they had a close friendship. So she does that multiple times through the piece. All right, let's continue reading. So now if you could go ahead and pause, read this column, and then go ahead and hit play. All right, so what we see is the word reflect. The purpose of that is to create a thoughtful tone where we know that Thatcher is reflecting upon what made him great. Then we see this anaphora of he. So she talks about herself for a moment here where we see I, but she quickly returns to then repeating he at the beginning of sentences and clauses so that it doesn't linger too much on us paying attention to her, because this is in fact a speech about Reagan. And so she uses the anaphora to return attention to him, and by repeating he, it also creates this powerful sense that he has done so much. He had firm principles, he expounded, he acted, he was not baffled or disoriented or overwhelmed. Oh, and actually here, I missed this, we have some polysyndeton here, and again, this builds just how many things he has done. Then we have this standalone paragraph that's one sentence. He knew almost instinctively what to do, and so therefore we have this organized for emphasis, again, just to bolster how amazing of a president he was, according to Thatcher. Then we have aides, allies, and enemies. And so this shows that his greatness was clear no matter the relationship. He was great to his aides, he was great to his allies, and even to his enemies. He was a great and firm leader. Then we have never simplistic. It was being eaten away by systemic failures. A man of goodwill might nonetheless emerge from within its dark corridors. So why these items are underlined and circled is because it's showing that Reagan was a wise and intelligent and fair man. And so even though he was facing the Soviet Union that was very difficult from the United States, he didn't believe that they were purely evil, even though there's a quote earlier on where he calls it the evil empire. But it's the idea that he saw that potentially good things could come from the Soviet Union, and therefore he had a complex understanding of foreign policy, and therefore hoped that goodness could emerge from the relationship or the negative relationship that they currently had. All right, so next up, move to the next page, pause, read this, and then we'll annotate. All right, so what you should first notice is Ford to shake his hand and offer sincere cooperation. So again, this goes into the idea of the wise and intelligent and fair peacemaker. Then we have large-hearted magnanimity, and then more American. So this shows that Reagan was bigger than life, a true American, and then that continues here. Perfect sympathy between them, loved America, freedom and opportunity for ordinary people. So here she brings in the common man, making Reagan relatable to those listening to her speech. And so when we put this all together, we then need to find the shifts. So the first shift we find goes from here all the way down to here. And what we see in the first section of our essay is it opens by establishing his ethical character and why Thatcher is a dependable source. So that's what our first paragraph would be about. Our next shift occurs here. And in this section, she depicts him as a savior to not only the American people, but to the world. Then our next shift comes here, and therefore we have a lot. It goes from here to here, all the way through here. And essentially what she's doing is she uses the Cold War to demonstrate his strength and fairness. And in the very last section that's much shorter, she explains despite these achievements, he was just a common American man. So remember, after you've done your annotations, you need to go through and divide it into 3 or 4 sections and identify what she's doing in each of these sections. Then you'll be able to compile these into a thesis. So once you know what each of your body paragraphs are going to prove, you can then have your overall proof, which is what the entire essay that you're about to write is going to prove. And so a resulting thesis might read the following. Utilizing her friendship with Reagan as a source of authority on his persona, Margaret Thatcher depicts Reagan as a savior who led the world to peace by displaying both strength and fairness during the Cold War. However, despite his numerous strengths, Thatcher ultimately emphasizes that Reagan was simply a common American patriot. So this thesis takes us through each of the items that are going to be our body paragraphs. And in each of these body paragraphs, you will pull, not all of them, but some of the annotations in order to prove your point. All right, so if you haven't, go ahead and place all these annotations into your document. Then I would like for you to move on to video 2. Thanks so much. Bye.